Good evening and welcome to the Rectory on Thursday evening on the 7th of May. Now tomorrow, as I'm sure you know, is the day the nation is going to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Now that day in the Anglican calendar would normally be given over to Mother Julian of Norwich. So this being the eve of her day, we're going to spend a little time reflecting on her life and contribution for us all those years later. Now, we don't know an awful lot about Julian. We assume that Julian was this same woman who, at the age of 30 in 1373, was suffering, so it was believed, from a terminal illness. But nevertheless, produced a series of 16 visions which revealed aspects of God's love. And the style in which they're written is very much that of the mystical tradition. They take some decoding. Now, you don't need to be particularly great at mental arithmetic to realise we're talking about the same time in European history as Catherine of Siena, whom I mentioned in a previous video. So we're talking about the middle to the late portion of the 14th century, a time when Europe was undergoing great upheaval religiously and demographically because of the ravages of the plague. It was, as you may remember from my video just yesterday about the English Reformation, a time of dissent, political and religious dissent. The religious dissenters were known as the Lollards, and this sort of interwove with the popular movement that went to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And Norwich at that time was the second most important city after London in England, indeed a position it had right through until the 17th century. Now, at some point, Julian went into the church which now bears her name to become an anchoress. And an anchoress doesn't mean that somebody sort of literally sort of tied down with a chain. It simply means that somebody has chosen to withdraw from a public life for the purposes of prayer and reflection. And indeed it was irrevocable, and the punishments, the spiritual punishments, so it was thought, were very severe, eternal damnation to hell. So it was very much one-way traffic into those cells. However, as it was sometimes the case, or well, maybe often the case, that anchorites were perhaps better born, there was the cell, but perhaps another small suite of rooms and perhaps a garden. And all the needs of the anchorite or the anchoress were met by other members of the community, handing things through apertures or through squints, including the provision of food and the end product of that going the other way. I'll say no more than that. So at some point, these visions were written down and became part of a tradition of mysticism in England, of which Marjorie Kemp is another example. But it reminds me that how much things change and how much things in this country have changed comparatively rapidly thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Norwich, my hometown, in Julian's time, had 68 churches, and there was provision for I think 30 plus anchorites attached to these institutions. Now 31 of those medieval churches remain to this day, which still gives Norwich the greatest concentration of pre-Reformation church buildings in Northern Europe, and in its time it was regarded as perhaps the most religious or devout city in Europe. Well, her book, which I've had a long time because it only cost 85p brand new, is Revelations of Divine Love, and I think it's still published in the Penguin Classic series. And you can still go to Norwich to see what is actually a reconstruction of her cell, because the church in which she was anchored actually sort of fell down and was rebuilt in the middle of the 19th century. It comes under the cure of St John's Timber Hill, which is a church in Norwich that retains high church, very old and Anglo-Catholic traditions. It's also where I go from time to time when I'm home for midweek services. Now, there's been a comparison with Julian with our present day, because there are many of us, actually involuntarily rather than voluntarily like Julian, who have been caused to withdraw somewhat from the life that we know and we normally inhabit. And like Julian, perhaps it provides some calm and focus for an exploration of our relationships with God, and our determination also to stay home means that we're maintaining our spiritual lives as well as saving lives, protecting the NHS by staying home, which we're bidden to do. So I just offer up those thoughts, and I'll provide some links in the description box below if you're interested. A photograph of the present day cell, which is a site of pilgrimage to be sure, and I hope, as I've mentioned in the past, it might be possible to have a parish trip all that way east to see some of these religious sites, and Julian's being one of the most important, and of course Julian dating from a time also when Walsingham, up near the North Norfolk coast, was known as England's Nazareth. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit rest upon you this night and always. Amen.